Hi, welcome to another episode of Dirk and Swap Conversations on Open Source. And we have with us once again Dirk Honda. Dirk, first of all, welcome to the show once again.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Today we're going to talk about toxic people. But I should admit that it's not that open source has this problem of toxic people. They are everywhere. Just that there is some percentage of those people, and the problem with these toxic people are is that they tend to be very vocal. They're loud. They may not have a strong argument, but they do tend to have loud voice. Before we talk about toxicity in the open source world, can we just talk about toxicity in general in the tech world itself? Because what happens is sometimes tech people tend to look at things from a totally different prism. We are going through this political crisis right now, and every time, one of the biggest chunks of my friend circle is tech people, and those are the ones they always get into arguments, and those arguments are more about logical, rational, and those things get heated. For other people, it becomes more emotional. So let's just talk about toxicity in general in the tech field.
So I think toxicity is in a way a function of how intent people are to be heard. And so you said that often toxic people are loud. I think often they are toxic because they are so loud. It is perfectly fine to disagree, to have a different opinion, maybe even to have a wrong opinion, an opinion that is generally considered not okay, like an opinion every white guy is an asshole. Plenty of evidence that this could be true, but as a general statement, it's most likely wrong. It is still fine to have such an opinion. The problem is if all you do is reinforce that and repeat it and insert it into every conversation. And one of the things that we have in the tech field is we have a lot of people who have been successful very early in their lives, and they have established a personal behavioral pattern that assumes that they are right, that assumes that they know the answer, and that transfers this knowledge in a very narrow area to a much larger area that they suddenly start talking about. And as a result, they become toxic in those conversations. So that's really how I look at toxicity and why it's so prevalent in the tech world.
Let's talk about open source, which is a subset of tech world. I don't know which is superset because open source is everywhere. Um, we tend to hear or see more toxic people here. I see two reasons. Number one is that most of the open source projects that we look at or are involved with are like created by an individual, or group of people. They don't work for a specific company, and it's more or less we see when you work under a corporate environment or any other such culture, you have some restrictions on what you can or cannot say publicly because that will have direct impact on your job. But when you're kind of independent, you can say whatever you want to say. You get opinionated, and then you also feel free to share your opinion. Number two, being part of that project, either as a leader, you feel kind of empowered that you have followers, so you do feel that you can say whatever you want to say. Does that also play a role?
So I want to start at the beginning of what you just said, where you said you think there are more toxic people in open source. I'm not sure that's true. I think there are a lot of toxic people wherever you go. And if you talk to people about a random workplace, talk to your friends about how is work at that bakery, how is work at that factory, how is work in this EMT company, how is work in this ER. And everyone will sooner or later get to the people in their environment who are toxic. I think they exist everywhere. But the other point that you made, I think, is very important because if you have toxic people that also have a specific skill set that makes them good at something, which is often the case, most people are good at something. And if you then make this something that they're good at, one of the key criteria to establish their role, their importance, their visibility in a project, now you're in trouble. Because suddenly the person who leads the project or leads an aspect of what the project does, and therefore has a big megaphone, has a big pedestal to stand on, a lot of people who are listening to them, suddenly that person can then become toxic to the project and has much more opportunity to deliver their toxicity than they would have in another scenario. But we've seen this in other worlds. I mean, we're trying to stay away from politics here. But if you look at people like the author of a very, very popular set of cartoons, who suddenly uses their platform to spout utter nonsense and show themselves as a truly toxic person. It is very similar to that. It's just in the open source world, because of the way these projects work, it is so much easier to suddenly be in a position where people follow you, where people listen to you, where you have that opportunity to be toxic and to continue on and not get punished for it. And your comment about the corporate environment curtailing this is a very important one, because where we have a functioning system to affect people who are toxic and to restrict their ability to continue on, we have far fewer of these people, which of course then brings us immediately to the need, or the question of the need, for a code of conduct in a project. Because very often the code of conduct is then the vehicle to replace what otherwise your HR department would do, to say, oh no, you can't behave like this, you can't act like this, you can't talk like this, you can't treat other people like this. And in order to facilitate this in an open community, you need a different mechanism, because you don't have that HR department.
Um, One more thing is that how would we define toxicity, or that people are, this person is toxic? There are two things. First of all, of course, people can have their own opinion. It could be either political, whatever it is. Sharing that is one thing. Second, it could be that that attitude is associated with the project itself, the way you deal or treat your co-workers, let's, for lack of a better word, or other people involved in the project, versus your worldview towards the rest of the world. I don't want to name anybody here, but there are different set of people who have very strong political opinions or opinions about things. At the same time, there are people who are almost neutral when it's come to that kind of politics, but the way they treat their project members, or they look at the project. So how would you define which kind of toxicity is bad or good? I mean, no toxicity is good.
So in my view, the key factor is everyone makes mistakes. It is perfectly normal that someone says something stupid, or that they aren't aware how a choice of word affects other people. I think over the last 12 months, a lot of us white people have learned about behaviors and about phrases and about things that we've done or said in the past, how they affect our Black friends. And we have done them for years, not realizing that we are hurting other people. And so I personally have retired a few phrases from my vocabulary. And I think that is hopefully true for a lot of others. That the key to describing someone as toxic to me is, once they find out that their behavior is offensive to others, that they decide they know better and continue that behavior. And that really is what I want to hone in on here. This idea of, yes, you told me this hurts you, I will do it anyway because my reasons are more important than your feelings. And that really is that line that so many people cross. And that is that line that has become so much more visible and so much clearer in all of our minds over the last few years, which is a good thing.
Which also means that, I mean, the way it is bad, since especially we are talking, especially in the context of open source, not political word or the tech word in general, is that it kind of impacts the maintainers, the people who are involved with the project. Sometimes people start leaving the projects as well. So it also impacts the project itself. I really do not care. Of course, I do care what you believe, how do you are not sensitive to others, but everybody has the right to hold whatever opinions they have, but it starts affecting the project. That is where the problem starts. Earlier you mentioned that corporate environments, they can curtail. Open source projects are coming with a lot of code of conduct. We have seen a lot of actually improvement in this space. There's one more thing I want to talk about, the trend that you're seeing, but there's one more thing that I want to talk about, is that most of the time when we look at these technologists or people who have created these projects, they're brilliant, smart people. Sometimes, as we have discussed, they are like at the spectrum of autism also. Sometimes they do not know how to deal with people because technology is where they find the solace. So sometimes they're also misunderstood because they just openly share their feelings and behavior. At the same time, the culture itself sometimes becomes so toxic. I was talking to Guido, who's the founder of Python. I think I said
Python, yes.
Python, yeah.
We differ also.
And we did not even know that, but he does a lot of work in diversity. He does a lot of work in mentorship. He actually says that I do not mentor any white men, or I don't. I on purpose, pick somebody who is either but the kind of pushback that I get on that interview, and some people start talking that also talks, hey, you're unnecessarily talking about this, just focus on technology. So there are two aspects of looking at it. So number one is that tech people, especially the creators of the projects, they tend to be not that good at interaction. They may also be at the spectrum of autism. Number one part is that. Number two is because of these, they sometimes are misunderstood as well. So how do we draw the line?
Well, I'm always a little careful with the misunderstood and I'm on the spectrum, because that can be an excuse, right? So this is the I'm on the spectrum, therefore you can't criticize me. Well, that's not how it works. But the drawing of the line is really complicated, because we have seen instances of people trying to weaponize hurt feelings against people who really aren't doing much of anything wrong, and where the toxicity is not necessarily the person doing the initial speaking that is being criticized, but it's the people who are trying to use that speech to take somebody down that they dislike for another reason. We've seen a number of instances of this with attacks against people who may not be perfect, but actually are trying to learn, trying to get better, who are being attacked for often historic reasons or for personal animosity. And people are using a code of conduct, people are using alleged misconduct to attack these people, even though there isn't really a lot of substance behind there. And so one of the hard parts in dealing with toxic people is that ability to step back and look at the conversation and saying, well, who is actually the toxic person here? Who is the person who is not willing to change their behavior, who is not willing to adjust their understanding of a situation based on new information, who is not able to move on? And it's not always as easy as it may sound in the typical HR examples when you do your training class on appropriate behavior. It's very simple. The person who says the absolutely impossible things is likely the person who's not in the right, and the poor victim is likely the person you need to defend. In real life, it's usually far more complicated. There's a lot more context. There's a lot more about the duration, about the interaction, the back and forth, and about the willingness to change, the willingness to listen, and the willingness to move on. And that, to me, is the part about toxicity that so often gets misunderstood.
So number one is the context that really matter. You need to look at what. I also want to talk about the help. It's very easy to criticize them. It's very easy to call them out. It's very easy, to punish and beat them up. But sometimes they need help also. You said something that was really interesting, and that was that, we have the right to make mistakes. That's how we learn. The problem starts when you start repeating the same mistake. It's okay to make new mistakes, right? The problem is when you start repeating the mistakes over and over again. Number two is also that the social networking, the social media world that we live in, that is where, a lot of cases what has happened is that things were taken out of context and it was spread across social media. So people did not even look at, a good example, Linus Torvalds, I cover him so much, but if you go and look at the actual context, you are like, there was nothing there. But you can very easily take one thing out of context and start spreading it. So when I was talking a misunderstood part, this is also a big problem where things are taken out of context and they're spread on social media, and suddenly you create a villain where none existed. So, and that's where you cannot do anything with code of conduct because that person was not doing anything wrong. So, as I mean, it's and you cannot control people that what they want to read, what they want to pick.
Yeah. So if you look at the latest versions of the popular codes of conduct, very typical, you have the phased response. So you get a warning, you get an opportunity to interact, you get an opportunity to learn before you get to expulsion or more serious responses to behavior. And to me, this is really important because it allows for that initial interaction that helps you to understand, is this an honest mistake? Is this a behavioral pattern that the person is willing to overcome? Or is this something where they feel that their behavior is appropriate and they intend to continue? So we have had this just recently with the whole language patterns and saying racially offensive things in a tech context. And I have had a heartbreaking conversation with a young developer who just continued to use these phrases. And every time we had a conversation on, this is why this is not a good phrase. This is what it means to people. And his response was, I don't care. That's not what I mean when I say it. And why do I have to listen to these people? It's that behavior where you have to say, okay, you were given the opportunity. You have been presented with plenty of contextual information to help you change your behavior. And if you then intentionally refuse to do so, well, then likely you are toxic. But on the flip side, in the exact same circumstance, a different person um, was very receptive to the input, and the context was, well, I actually didn't realize that is would never have occurred to me. I will change my behavior. And that, to me, that moment is the difference between someone who makes a mistake and someone who is toxic, and who the project may be better off when they remove that person.
Culture also play a very, when you mention, there's a guy who said I don't care. In many cultures, a lot of things, like in India, where we grew up, I mean, Hitler is the word which is used often, for anybody who's just being rude. Hey, and there's a word called Tanashahi. It's a word like Hitler, so it's not like Godwin's law, as it's very, very sensitive word here. And then there are a lot of terms. So a lot of people, they are not sensitive enough or empathetic enough to realize that. Now there are two things: either they are unwilling to do that, or they just, like, I don't want to bother. So there are two things: either you can remove them from the project, and that's when you made a point earlier, was that to help them, so just pointing them out. Because sometimes what happens, a lot of people, I mean, as much as I want to agree with you, but there are a lot of people who are creative enough, they can contribute so heavily to XYZ project, that sometimes it might be necessary enough to help them out. Because the way, if you look at bigger picture, humanity will benefit so much from their work, that pushing them away will be a much bigger loss, if you look at the large scale of thing. At the same time, just because their contributions are so huge doesn't mean that you will tolerate everything. So I'm not talking about tolerating them, but I'm talking about helping them.
This is really what the idea behind the warning is about, that you have that formal step where you interact, where you educate, where you try to understand, where you try to create understanding on both sides, and where you try to move forward in a constructive manner. And if that fails, you then have more severe steps. Because fundamentally, I do not care how brilliant you are. At the point where you are abusive and disrespectful to other people, and are unwilling to change your behavior, we have to part ways. I mean, in my personal open source project, I removed a developer who was fairly productive, but who consistently treated others with so much disrespect. And when pointed out, was not willing to even consider that their words were harmful or their behavior was inappropriate or anything. And we went through rounds and rounds of trying to move forward. And at some point, I had to say, no, we're done. This is not working. But I'll give you another example for how cultural context is important. So when you talk to people here in the United States, and you talk to them what they associate with the abbreviation SS, they think super sports car, they think manly, tough, fantastic. You talk to somebody of a German or Jewish background, they think Schutzstaffel, the worst atrocities of the Third Reich, Nazis, very, very negative connotation. And so trying to get people to not use SS as an abbreviation, because a large set of people feels this is a loaded, a very, very negative term, even if to you it's a positive thing. That is one of those areas where understanding matters and engagement and the opportunity to educate matters, and where you then see if people are willing to listen, people are willing to accept that while they may not feel that way, other people justifiably and reasonably feel that way. And either you can move on, or, well, you've identified the toxic person.
Also, the thing is that most of these people that we're talking about are part of open source community. And open source community, you are in most cases are volunteering, helping the other members. So you do have the tendency of helping others. So you should take some extra effort to understand the community member, the people who are who are either your co-workers, or people who are consuming it. So you are actually, honestly, you are taking time from your life, donating it to a cause that you directly don't benefit from. You're writing code that someone else is going to, so you're already doing something for good. So why not make an extra effort to just also learn about what are the words, what are the terms that, so saying that I don't care, that's not true, because you do care. That is why you are contributing to open source in the first place. If you did not care, you would not contribute or be involved with open source.
Yeah, and I think you're talking about one of those key things in open source where this is very often driven by your personal interest, by your enthusiasm for something, and there this balance of finding how much of myself can I bring, where are the boundaries where I need to constrain things that maybe I feel are okay, but that other people feel aren't okay. And the balance in open source often feels like it should be different, or it could be different from a corporate environment. But the reality is that the protections that we have for minorities, for people who are different from us in the corporate environment, are there for a reason. And so codes of conduct are typically designed to replicate these protections in an open source environment. So yes, I see this vision around, we want to do this out of the goodness of our heart, we have positive intentions here, as something that plays into my evaluation of somebody's behavior. But at the end of the day, the underlying reason for why we want to treat each other with respect and why we want to be decent human beings is maybe even more important in an open source project than in your day job.
I mean, you hit the nail when you said, being a decent human being, because that is applicable everywhere. Even if you're in a bus, you try to be nice. If you see an old person or a pregnant lady, you would give your seat. If your child, you try to be nice. Around your house, neighborhood, parties, we do tend to be. So why should our workplace, irrespective of whether it's volunteer work or paid work, we should not be nice person? Now, do you see any improvements in this space? We don't really hear that many stories these days about toxic people, toxicity. Is it because people are fed up of talking about that? Is it because a lot of bloggers, they are gone, they don't care about it, or they are really improvement because all the efforts? I mean, Linux Foundation is a very good example. They have childcare there, they have those rooms, so it changes the culture. And when the culture changes of a place, then because personally, we are all nice people. We live with a family. We do know how to behave properly. But suddenly, when we go out, we start misbehaving. So, talk about the change that is happening and what contributed to the change.
So, I certainly, sorry, I certainly hope that things have improved. And I, in my personal observation, I think that the situation has improved in a lot of projects and in the community in general. We have a lot more guardrails in place. There's a lot more acceptance that you have to behave in an appropriate manner. You have to behave to others in a respectful manner. We see a lot of work done at conferences this year, unfortunately, all virtual, to make sure that there is reasonable representation among the presenters, and that people, regardless where they come from, can feel safe. So I think we are seeing a lot of progress. At the same time, what we need to acknowledge is that over the last decade or two, we have lost a lot of people who came into these projects and were super excited and wanted to be part of them, and they moved on because they didn't feel safe. And so this is not something where we can say, oh, we're done. Okay, good, excellent, everything's fine now. I think this is a continuing process where we need to constantly be vigilant and look at how do we behave. Do we create a space where everyone feels welcome? And on the flip side, do we over-rotate? Do we discriminate against certain patterns of behavior that in and of themselves aren't bad? You mentioned people on the spectrum repeatedly in the beginning of our conversation. We want to make sure that we don't discriminate against people who have other challenges in following what is generally the accepted behavior. So it's a very complex topic. But what I really wanted to think about here is that willingness in a project, at a conference, at a company, to get to that final point where you say, no, this isn't acceptable, you've got to leave. And that really is the only tool that you have available in the presence of toxic people. Because all the warning, all the conversation, all the education, all the engagement is wonderful if it helps people to learn and to grow and to become a more productive part of this community. But at the end of the day, you will have people who just don't want to fit in, who just want to be allowed to behave the way that they think is cool or correct or appropriate, or due to them because of their role, or whatever the reason may be. And that willingness to say, here is the line, you cross this line, and we will expel you. We will say you are no longer welcome here. That really is the key criterion to be successful in a larger environment these days. You have to be willing to do that. You have to be willing to move on. And you have to be willing to make it clear to everyone involved that this line exists and that you are willing to expel them. You're willing to draw the consequences. And that really is what, to me, makes the big difference between it just being words and between the actions matching your words and matching your intentions, because that's how you can create lasting change. And that's what we're after.
Yeah, a positive change, because I was just when you're talking about it, I was thinking about my own interaction with a lot of open source projects, and I had a really positive experience that I have never experienced somewhere else. Mostly whenever I go to Europe to attend GNOME or KDE or LibreOffice events, uh, first of all, what I do see is there's a very good mix of male and female. They're both there, and it's so I have never even felt that because the way the interactions were happening, that this was not even a problem there. I mean, there was not a single toxic person where you'll see, hey, that person is, because the culture was so welcoming. They had set a culture in a way that a toxic person will feel uncomfortable. So even if you are toxic, you do know this is not the place to voice out your grievances or opinion. There. So what I want to say is that yes, there can be warnings, but if we can just build the culture of our project in a way that it becomes the whole what is the character of that project, so that toxic people will not find a soapbox to stand up and talk, because they know they are not welcomed there. So even if they are toxic, and you're right, I mean, we are, to some degree, we become Apple fans or Android fans or Canon fans or Nikon fans, it is our political parties, but we do know that this is not the place to do those things. So we can still. So how much role do you think culture of a project, the character of a project, can also play there? Because this is something we can do very easily.
So as a European, of course, I like what you're saying, but I also think you're wrong. I think we see toxicity, we see negative people everywhere. I have been to many events in Europe where there were problematic people, problematic behavior. I have actually been involved in the process of having somebody kicked out of a conference in Europe over their behavior. So, and that was a European person. So I think it's always dangerous to oversimplify this. Culture plays an important role. Culture is all about expectations of expected behavior. Culture is about mutual understanding what you mean with your words, with your gestures, with your whole interaction with others. And it is always important as a context for what is happening. And it's important for us to understand the culture on the other side. But as I said earlier in my example with the abbreviation SS, a big part of this is then to also be willing to accept that the behaviors that in your culture may be perfectly fine, in another culture may be very offensive. And that is the part that transcends all of these regions, and that transcends the tech community and the open source community, because it's true across the board. It's true in all communities. My wife is an avid knitter, and in that world, the rules are different, but fundamentally, the challenges that people face are still the same.
No, I just want to make one thing clear. When I said, in Europe, I didn't mean Europe in general. I meant those projects in general that I attended in Europe. And the reason I said, because those projects are more active in Europe. And second thing that I did notice was that because here in US, the rest, you have to travel all the way. Europe is so very well connected that the people who are from India, from Africa, from Italy, from France, from Germany, so from even from Asia. So it was, first of all, a very good mix of people. And second was, I was more talking about those projects specific, not Europe as a region specific, that those projects, because they created a culture in a way that it was more or less like, since they're like enough female, enough diverse people, so they were more empathetic and sensitive towards each other. And I think the reason was not that those people were like that, since there was a mix of people and they became friends, so they became sensitive and empathetic towards each other. So what I was talking about was, if we build the culture of a project in that way, then everybody kind of feels responsible for their own behavior. So you're right. It's not that in Europe everything is rosy, and no, I fully agree with you. But I was talking about some specific projects there. So I fully agree with you there. Yeah.
The inclusive culture, the inclusive approach is really critical to all that. And to be perfectly blunt with you, with COVID going on, and the lack of travel and the lack of interaction, and I worry if some of this will change. I worry if everyone working from home, being on Zoom all day and not interacting with other humans as much in a direct manner, will over time affect our behavior towards each other and will affect the culture in these projects. So I think we are in a crazy time, and I think we are in a time that throws so many challenges, so many problems ahead of us, that we just need to keep watching, be willing to learn, be willing to change our behavior, and pay attention and listen to other people, so we understand how our behavior, how third parties' behavior affects all of us.
No, I think that's perfect advice that you're giving there. And yes, we have to also, beware of, how this COVID is going to change, because you're right. We are not interacting. We are not seeing people face to face. We are not hanging out with them. We'll see what will be the long lasting. But I really love the last word you said there. I think we can. That's the perfect ending. We can wrap this conversation with those nice words and advice. Dirk, once again, thank you for your time, and I look forward to talk to you again next time.
Likewise. Thank you, Swapna.